Hey everyone, back again finally. I was moved from LA back to Montreal, so things were a little bit chaotic, but we are back. We're back into this. We're coming back with Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, or subtitle, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Now, before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical concepts and texts and stuff and ideas to try to make them accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can find this as a YouTube video, or sometimes on my YouTube channel, sometimes there's videos. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it as just a podcast where there's pretty much only podcasts. There shouldn't be any ads. There shouldn't be. But in any case, you can go find this under all the same names and stuff. You'll be able to find it as a podcast on all major podcast platforms. And yeah, give it a listen. If you like what I do, you can follow me on other platforms. Just follow the links in the descriptions. If you're curious, please consider donating to help Palestinians in need in fighting against Israeli occupation, genocide, and apartheid. These are things that have been going on for decades to the Palestinians and needs to be remedied. Now, please consider this. I'm going to talk more about Palestinian resistance probably in episode 2, because part of the task here in this book is problematizing the idea that Marxism is the one viable theoretical anti-oppressive strategy, when, as Robinson will show here, there is a well-documented anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, many different kinds of struggles that have in no way been strict adherents to Marxists or Marxism. But we're going to get into all of that. So how this is going to work is part 1 is each part is just going to cover each part of the book. So there's 3 parts of the book. Each episode is going to cover each of those parts. And so today, without further ado, let's jump into part 1, or the introduction, and then part 1. So simply, all that Robinson is doing here is asking whether Marxism and black radicalism, that is the black radical tradition, which we're going to get into, if they are compatible, given Marxism's European undertones. Marxism is incredibly European in its history. Now, this does demand a lot more nuance, because there have obviously been many different Marxist movements that have happened all over the world. It is by no means a European movement, but for all intents and purposes is actually exercised the most not even in Europe. So it's definitely not a European thing. However, some of its ideological roots are certainly European, and we're going to get into that. But this is what Robinson is encouraging us to ask. Robinson is encouraging us to ask in what ways Marxism falls short when actually accounting for the specific kinds of oppressions that black people whose legacy comes from historical enslavement and colonialism and exploitation and everything horrible under the sun, whether or not that Marxist analysis can in any way encapsulate and capture those experiences and provide an actually useful way to understand them. Now, with all of this, in no way is Robinson saying that Marxism is useless. Like, obviously not. That would be totally ridiculous. If there's a Marxist out there who's like, yeah, this text is useless because it's like critical of Marxism, then frankly, you're not a true Marxist. I mean, I'll just say it. Marxism is, I think, if you look back at the original text, maybe I'm more of a Trotskyist in this way, it does demand perpetual evaluation and negotiation, and it's going to take on different forms in different places, which isn't always respected. In fact, there are quite a few contingents of Marxists that remain heavily committed to essentially just making Marxism a European project, or it's about turning the world into Europe, which I don't think is truly Marxist, but some people who claim the title, they believe such things. Now, before jumping into part 1, still within the introduction, he provides another very important term, and that is racial capitalism. And it's a little bit of a redundant term. Indeed, capitalism has always been racist, and capitalism has always relied on the quote-unquote existence, or at least the creation of the categories of race, in order to identify cheap sources of labor, or potentially free sources of labor in terms of enslavement. And scientific logics of race have been effective at justifying the economic and labor exploitation of certain people, because scientific racism would say that people of certain races are not even human, and therefore you can do whatever you want to them. You can exploit them, you can enslave them, and so on. And so capitalism has always used racism. Now, one of the things he really wants us to move away from, though, is thinking as though capitalism just birthed these things, just birthed all these problems. Or that seems like I'm whitewashing, I'm just calling them problems, but these oppressions, when really they far antedate capitalism. I mean, the history of enslavement goes back way before capitalism. I mean, we just look at the history of Jews, for example. Like, obviously, histories of enslavement go way far back. And the immediate Marxist response would be like, yeah, well, that was a more infantile stage of economic development. But what that is implying is that economic systems are determinative of their worlds. It is also implying that the world moves through broad historical phases in which there's broad historical consensuses or whatever, that and agreements as to what constitutes a period, which isn't true at all. And it also ignores how many of these things don't just disappear. How enslavement is still today, even though we're supposed to be in quote-unquote late capitalism, enslavement is still alive and well. Still very much alive and well. So it's like, what's going on here? Like, clearly, the Marxist view of capitalism as a totalizing system that pushes people into classes and therefore encourages a kind of class consciousness is a little bit naive. It's a little bit naive, but, just putting it out there. But just for the sake of this, racial capitalism looks at the ways in which capitalism relies on older race-based ways of thinking. And it's not just race-based, but they're xenophobic in other ways, be it religious, national, or any other kind of distinction that can be used in order to separate humans or self-perceived humans from perceived non-humans. And these have been historical tools of exploitation for thousands and thousands of years, which isn't also to say that it's like natural or anything like that, because it is not at all. But it is not easily reducible to just simply economic conditions, which is often what Marxists, very importantly, this isn't to disparage that observation, but that's not the whole story. So Marxism's historical focus on European industrialization, where Marx looks at the birth of class consciousness in industrial, maybe attribute it to the French Revolution, look at that period, or English industrialization. This is a very narrow and incredibly myopic way of looking at world history, to be like, it is at this period, with these people, that they attained the right class formation that will undo the historical oppression found with and conflict that has always existed between classes, or before they were classes, between serf and lord, between enslaver and enslaved. This is the kind of dream of Marxism, is that beyond capitalism we will rectify all of these oppressions, and there will finally be this turn towards a truly free economic system guided by the workers themselves, guided by the people who produce, who are the productive agents in the world. I'm being incredibly reductive here, but still, like, it's quite a claim to be like, and this happened in Europe in this period at this time with these people. Like, excuse me? There have been tons of different kinds of resistances to these kinds of exploitation all over the world. Like, why are we just associating it with Europe? And that puts us here, or well, it ignores like all the. Well, we're going to look into all of it, but that puts us here into part 1, the emergence and limitation of European radicalism. And with this, chapter 1, racial capitalism, the non-objective character of capitalist development. Now, against some popular perspectives, capitalism was not born from a negation of the feudal order that preceded it, apparently, but by the quote-unquote extension of these social relations to more people and to more land. Capitalism would then maintain the unequal structures found in systems that preceded it, like enslavement, like serfdom, etc., while permeating at that time, and that spread throughout that time, and it would extend these kinds of oppressions to way more people and include other things like religious hierarchies, nationalist hierarchies, economic hierarchies, etc. So to give you an idea, this is the basic Marxist idea of human economic history, where we've got, and I'm being very reductive about this, but it should give you the kind of general picture. Now, for Marx, this is Marx's dream, and I think that, I mean, he's really brilliant for this, but like, humankind goes through these periods of constantly trying, or their entire lives, everyone's lives is like about supplying for themselves. And this has been the primary basis upon which societies have been organized, which means us dealing with people doing work to sustain themselves and the world they live in. And indeed, that goes on very much still to this day. And this has been structured in many different ways. And Marx just kind of looks at it in very general terms, where not just general terms, but, you know, in pretty general terms, where he's like, people were largely using enslavement for a long time. And then with the general emancipation of laborers, of people, of money, of wealth, then came a kind of dynastical association with the land and the willingness to put people to work in a kind of more amicable relationship, where you had people working on the land that would be able to have land, have home, have shelter, but are providing for the Lord. And then with capitalism, we see an even further development of a quote-unquote liberation of productive, that is working subjects, that is workers, in the form of them becoming free wage laborers. That is, they can technically, you find this in like Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, you can technically go and work wherever you want. This is one of the illusions of capitalism. You can, if you're not being paid enough, go work somewhere else. It's like no one's forcing you to. And of course, that totally ignores how you are, in fact, forced to do it. But putting that aside, this is the idea. And then from there, as historically we've been seeing this steady emancipation of workers, Marx just kind of postulates, like, we've gone through these radical transformations. What's to stop us from imagining communism coming from the future? Like, what's to stop us from imagining that? And this is it's a very interesting idea. It leaves a lot to speculation. No one knows what it's actually going to look like. Marx had no idea. You can find kind of traces of post-capitalist futures and ideas about what it'll look like in his books. Like he doesn't like fully schematize it. But in any case, like, this is the Marxist idea about human history and human economic development in a nutshell. But the simple thing that Robinson says here is just to be like, none of these things have gone away. It's not like we are now in this capitalist world and we've said goodbye to enslavement, to feudalism, to everything like this. Like, I'm just right off the top of my head, there's, for anyone who follows, European politics, you probably know Yanis Varoufakis, who wrote the book Techno-Feudalism. And I mean, just from the title alone, we are already getting the sense that, like, and if you look at the tech landscape and you look at the way things are organized, it doesn't seem all that capitalist. I mean, you now have people like Trump who are pretty much just like a kind of weird variant of socialists in the way that he's like governmentally affecting the market. If it had been anyone who claimed to be left-wing doing these things, then it would have been doomsday, like doing this kind of things with the market, actually affecting it, not letting the market run itself. But it just makes it so plain to see that the apparently most pro-capitalist parties in America are just like controlling it in this strange kind of, do you call it fascism? I don't know. You call it more like, I don't even know what you'd call it. It's like state-run capitalism. It's weird. It's kind of like fascism. It's Hitlerite. But like with that, we see this, this problematizes the idea that capitalism is this opening up of just labor potential. Instead, we see how these previous systems still maintain themselves to this day, and there aren't these neat divides from one period to another that we often find within Marx and Marxists that would come after him. But it's kind of concerning the way in which Marx attributes or kind of looks at human history through the lens or through the prism of European history. And that's incredibly ironic because he's looking at a situation, he's looking at the formation of classes, he's looking at industrialization in the European context, and he's saying, look, this is a template for all of human history. And those people over there, those people in China, he's like, they're just still like despotic. You know, they're still caught in the past. He would then go on to justify the colonization of India, because that would be a way by which Europe could emancipate Indians from their traditions and bring them into the capitalist world order, because it's only through capitalism that we can attain this better system. And we haven't even really gotten into the critiques yet, but it should be plain enough to see how there may be some holes in this. But by looking at Europe in this way and exalting it as the site through which world history is progressing, what he is doing is a lot of things, but one of the more pernicious elements here is normalizing Europe's historical violences against neighboring regions and also those far abroad, and how by ignoring that, or by just attributing it to like capitalist development or a necessary evil, which is something Marx says as well. He says that enslavement was a necessary evil for the emergence of capitalism. It's like, okay, it seems like you're actually really okay with like mass violence, occupation, horror, if it will mean that we might get this speculated better world one day, which I hold on to this dream too. I mean, I'm with you. I think that it's a very important thing to fight for. But if these unexamined elements of its ideological approach, that is Marxism, are not accounted for, then we risk only ever repeating the same cycles. This is what Jean Baudrillard calls the mirror of production, where we end up, by trying to oppose capitalist industry and capitalism and capitalist production, we end up, by not examining these things, we end up just replicating it. So it's no longer about like, how do we exploit these people to make profit? It's like, how do we turn these people capitalists so we can eventually be communists? And that's that is exactly what Marx said about India, even though he's repudiating capitalism. And this is exactly what Marx meant when he said that enslavement was a necessary evil. It's like, so you'd be the first to line up then, Marx, for enslavement. Like, he didn't have the easiest life, but, wasn't enslaved. But one of the biggest and most important ideological and oppressive tools to be found in Europe is this appropriation of the logic of us versus them. And Marx does this when he just talks about this thing called like Europe. Because really though, what are we talking about? Where Robinson will discuss here, he'll talk about the way in which even within Europe, like, it's not as though everybody in Europe was viewed in the best light. He uses the example of the Irish who, when the English like invaded Ireland, they were treating or viewed Irish people as being like subhuman, closer to whatever racist caricature you can imagine. That's like, oh, okay, so clearly we see that this isn't really a European thing, because that wasn't part of Europe, even though it shared the same kind of geographical connection to it and the same kind of racial configuration as far as we know. At the time they didn't think so, but regardless, with that is then revealed that we don't even, like, what is Europe? We just these are some terms we just kind of deploy for the sake of convenience, but they have like real impacts when we're using them to discuss the future of possible anti-oppressive resistance and actually like improving people's lives. And to some Marxists, I'm sure me raising this want to rip their hair out if they have any, and think that this is just like muddying the waters or it's distracting from the cause. And if thinking about these things is distracting from the cause, then I think your cause is a little bit too fragile, I would think. I think that actually Marxism can take it, in my opinion. I think it can really take these kinds of challenges and we can build from them. But anyways, I digress. Us versus them. Robinson traces this back to the Romans. When the Romans adopted this very clear-cut distinction between the insider Romans and the outsider barbarians. And this logic of us versus them, of insider versus outsider, would play itself out even in Marx's writings, but certainly in the broader colonial expeditions of like European colonial expansion. But for Marx, it just translates into like, you have those enlightened masses of industrialized workers, and then everyone else is still like caught in the past. It's kind of us versus them thing. But that will really pose a problem, because, as Robinson will show, resistances to capitalism have actually not historically really been done by the people who Marx predicted it would be done by. Because Marx predicted that capitalism's demise will come from the people who have been put in a position to be exploited as free laborers, that is, wage laborers, and who have and possess a certain amount of knowledge, not just economic knowledge, but broader historical and philosophical knowledge that will allow them to identify the oppressive tendencies of capitalism. But if you actually look, at history, communism has not been actually enacted by industrialized working classes, because those people have historically gotten the goods of the system. That is, they've been people who've historically actually really benefited from capitalism in a lot of ways. Of course, there's been rampant exploitation. I don't want to deny that. But people in like the global north, people in industrialized parts of the world who are indeed exploited, have been historically much less exploited than the people who are currently being enslaved to produce goods at affordable costs for people in the global north and the industrialized sectors of the world, attesting to the fact that these systems are still very much at play. How things like enslavement and feudalism did not just disappear when capitalism emerged. So without interrogating this kind of us versus them mentality, Robinson is concerned that Marxism might just reappropriate the tools of European capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, etc., and reappropriate them into new terms. And we see it in Marx, like I said before, the case of India or enslavement. Like, it seemed like actually he was kind of okay with some pretty horrible kinds of oppressions. While he was very much, correctly so, not okay with capitalist exploitation, he seemed to be very much okay with other kinds of exploitation, which should raise at least one or two little alarms. I'm not saying anyone has to be perfect, but definitely something to consider. Now for some history here. Now, this is probably not the best place to say this, 20 minutes in, but this text is very historically dense. You need to read it yourself if you want the full picture. I'm going to do my best to give the best kind of overview here, but there's so much historical stuff, it wouldn't make sense for me to I'm not just going to sit down and read off facts, because that'll be boring. So I'm trying my best to narrativize it, but still, you got to read it to get the full effect, but regardless. Now, for some of this history. The bourgeois likely emerged primarily from the merchant class of the 10th, the 9th centuries in Europe and neighboring continents, really all over the place. And they were largely nomadic and allowed for trade and connections to emerge across borders when borders started to become more solidified 400 or 500 years later. So you had this merchant class of people, of really traveling traders, not traitors, traders that would, be the origins of what we know to be the bourgeois class in under capitalism. And they were opposed to, or they weren't necessarily opposed to, but they weren't the same as the aristocracy. The aristocracy were likely aristocrats who were rich because their families were rich and just inherit a bunch of money. Traders are perhaps people that were, they likely came from a rich background. Maybe they got lucky. Maybe they, got good at some skill and was able to produce something that they could sell, whatever. For whatever reason they're there, they're perhaps the precursor to the capitalism that we know today. Now, by way of a qualification, just because people work with money or make money doesn't mean that they're capitalists. Workers aren't capitalists even though they're technically paid. Capitalists are people who normally possess a good amount of wealth, but invest that wealth with the hopes of earning more wealth. But this wealth comes about not through fair exchange, but it comes through exploitation. That is the exploitation of workers. Now, when the capitalist makes money, what makes them capitalists is that they aren't just taking all that money and spending it on a yacht. They have some of it dedicated to growing their business so that they are in the business of just perpetual growth. Now, this is what capital is versus profit. Capital is money that has been reinvested into one's business or some other money-making source to earn them more money that comes about through the exploitation of labor power. ultimately for the production of commodities that can be sold at a value or at a rate that is higher than what it costs to make them. So in that process, you have the people making the things that aren't being paid what they are earning, the capitalist. Now that's different from somebody who's like, if you're like an artisan, for example, and you had an apprentice who you're teaching how to do something, this isn't capitalism. You're not exploiting them to grow your business. Like there's like a use value at the end of this. There's something that's coming out of this. It is the attained knowledge that you're bestowing upon this person that's going to go off and make their own shop, and they'll make things and then they'll sell them, and then that's it. Like they aren't growing a business into a dynasty or hiring a bunch of workers that they're going to undercharge for their work. Now it is a mystery though. I mean, the origins of capitalism are still quite mysterious. I don't think that this has been settled. But there could have been a whole number of factors. You had this merchant class of the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries that were responding to a lot of changes at the time. There were population changes. There were changes in scientific knowledge about how to do production, et cetera, et cetera. But these necessitated more trade and production themselves. And so these merchants took on a singular role in concentrating wealth in certain areas to essentially like revitalize the idea of cities, which, historically there had been a lot of really amazing cities in human history, but like capitalism or this investment of trading potential in the 10th, 11th centuries started to like build cities up in what would we recognize now in a kind of capitalist way. But they kind of hit a wall though. And that wall was the bubonic plague of the 14th and 15th centuries, where this kind of messed everything up. There was also the 100 Years' War, which didn't help at all either. So there were a lot of changes. There was like population growth and then extreme population decline with this war, with the bubonic plague, where millions and millions of people died. Not to mention, on top of this, there were quite a few, in the 14th and 15th centuries, there were quite a few revolts by peasants, by artisans, by the petit, small petit bourgeois, like the small bourgeois, or like people maybe new into money. They don't have a lot of money, but maybe they own like a shop or something, and they hired, they have a few workers, whatever. Like people resisting government power, people resisting exploitation in other forms, and it was an intense period. And so with this in the 14th and 15th centuries, there was population decline. People weren't having as many kids. Things were actually not going so great because the world kind of sucked all over the place. But this would also coincide with what we know to be the origins of capitalism at that period. Now, of all the people to make it through this period, the bourgeois class managed to get through, but precisely because they did not manage to get through. And what I mean by that is that they weren't an established class by then. Instead, when we're talking about trade and we're talking about merchants in these ways, like they embody a different kind of logic. They take on something more of like an adaptive logic or an adaptive disposition. So many people died. Many of these early bourgeois type trading class people ended up dying or fleeing or whatever. But they would eventually be replaced by others who, in Robinson's words, were willfully adaptive to the new conditions and possibilities offered by the times, end quote. Opposing the idea that the bourgeois clung onto life by appropriating the older administrative and aristocratic apparatuses. That is, they didn't cling on to life, their merchant ways, by just appropriating the aristocracy or religious authorities or governments or anything like this. They did so by embracing a different kind of like adaptive logic that would allow them to maintain their kind of trade and maintain their production or maintain their profits in however way that they imagined it, and to allow them to keep doing their things, but to do so in a chaotic world. And indeed, with chaos comes demand. And they were there at that moment to kind of fill in this demand. And they would actually make good bedfellows with a new emerging idea of the state, which as we see today, states are just they're essentially just capitalist management systems. That is, they just manage the flow of money. It just seems like you watch debates about politicians, and one of the big debate things that they'll always discuss is like the budget, money, like industry, as though these are political concerns. And indeed, they should be now, because that's the world we've created. But that's not what political concerns have been all the time. But this new kind of state, one that would just essentially fulfill the role of managing the flow of capital globally, this would emerge at this time, and this was a kind of thing that these merchant classes hung on to, and it would get them through the bubonic plague and this time of crisis. So with this alone, we see something, I think that there's something interesting to observe just in the distinction between maybe the older form of this merchant class and during the bubonic plague, after it, the new form it took on. That is, the old form might have been more committed to religious institutions, the aristocracy, and so on, but the new form is going to be more was more attached to the state in a certain kind of way. And there's another like longer history here. I mean, the state and capital have always kind of worked really harmoniously together, despite what are often just like illusory debates about state spending and capitalism and everything like that. But this class had a vested interest in the state because they were more opposed to the aristocracy and religious authorities than they were to the state, because they could appropriate the state. The state is like essentially lifeless and doesn't really have values. But things like the aristocracy are stubborn and religious institutions are stubborn. And so this new period saw these merchant classes appropriating this new structure, and that would be the state. But this really problematizes the idea that even any of these singular classes, like the working class or bourgeois or whatever, this isn't settled science, what they even really look like. Now, we can all recognize that exploited workers fall very comfortably within the camp of the exploited working class, like, no doubt. But the degree that they're exploited varies drastically from region to region. The other kinds of discrimination they experience, be it racial, be it gendered, be it ableist, etc., like, that will have extreme determining effects on how they are exploited, which are things that are worth considering and not just like papering over under the common umbrella of just like working class. Like, what? Really? That's so reductive. But with all of this, across both of these kind of broad periods here with the bourgeois, or with the merchant classes that would eventually culminate into the bourgeois, we see that they had different affiliations. They weren't this like consistent homogeneous mass. So he writes that the class that is so consistently identified with the appearance of industrial capitalism was inextricably associated with specific rational structures like the state, religious groups, communication technology, etc. And these factors belie any claim that capitalism presents a kind of systemic structure, or it is like totalizing. It has effects on everybody all the time in just like transforming world history, when it's like, no, that's not true at all. Now here, any appeals to the working class of a given nation are also quite suspect, because they imply that those workers were actually of that nation, which is very interesting. Like, there's this is a very interesting thing about the history of China. So during the Chinese Cultural Revolution afterwards, Mao and his people, they were like, okay, well, we've done this thing. It's kind of a thing. We got to figure out what other concerns people have. So they did this. They wanted to run these surveys. And I got this from, shout out to Sasha, one of my old colleagues who is an expert in the history of China. He was talking about this, where he's like, the People's Party of China then sent out these people to do these surveys about how many minority groups in China there were. And so they came back and they had like a list of like, I don't know, 500 or something. And the government was like, no, that's too many. That's too many. That is just too many. We can't do that. And they're like, okay. So they went back and came back with a list of like 30 or 40. And the government was like, okay, we can handle this. But this is where you get like the collapsing of all Uyghur people, into the banner of Uyghur, even though this is a title imposed on them. Many of them do recognize that and have now internalized that, but that has historically not been the case. There's a bunch of different communities there. The very idea of nations as an umbrella term and identity for large swaths of people is kind of a fairy tale. And it's one of those things that like Marxism just kind of very uncritically often adopts, even though it claims to be international, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to get into all that. But like, anybody who just talks about something like workers of a nation, we have to be a little bit suspicious here. And not only because of this kind of postmodern way in which I'm challenging this identity of the nation or nationhood, but also because many of these people were largely immigrants or migrants in like the 15th and 16th centuries. And like we see the same thing with many of these countries' armies. They were largely comprised of immigrants or migrants, people who didn't have familial, like their family roots in those places. And so this really like problematizes the idea that the people of a nation are of that nation and are workers in the form of being exploited wage laborers, when they were likely just like a kind of new feudalism that was just being applied to immigrants, attesting to the ways in which like capitalism depends upon non-capitalist forms of exploitation through enslavement, through feudalism, in order to proffer itself up. Like capitalism doesn't really provide that well, if you believe it or not. Like when the whole like tariff thing, we saw all these studies and stuff coming out about what products would cost if we didn't just get them from cheaper sources, which some would be very quick to be like, well, that's just capitalism turbocharged happening over there. When it's like, really? Doesn't the quantitative difference imply a sort of qualitative difference? But in any case, like we see that if suddenly people had to pay for things what they would pay for them if they were made domestically within a quote-unquote capitalist setting, we see that it is not viable. It is not sustainable. It's not viable. No one can afford anything. And so capitalism relies on these other systems in order to keep itself afloat. And so the very idea of like the entire world moving into like a perfectly capitalist one doesn't to me really seem very realistic. Like, and I think that I never really bought the whole like late stage capitalism thing. Like I think that if anything, we're like early days capitalism. Maybe it'll end tomorrow. I don't know. But anyways, yeah, I'm ranting. So rather than create these kinds of oppressions, Robinson is clear that capitalism would continue Europe's legacy to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences. And race thinking would be very important for capitalism in these ways, not only to justify enslaving certain people, but to also rally the military forces of a state to wage war against the people of other states to stifle their productive capacities, showing that capitalism is not a unifying factor in itself. Like, just because two nations are capitalist or because two people recognize that they are capitalist or of the working class does not mean that they'll just have this kind of automatic association, and they're actually they might go to war with one another and not recognize one another as being of the same ilk. So race thinking would infect the minds of the proletarian revolutionaries as well, and this quote-unquote radical intelligentsia, but we're going to get into that a lot more later on. For now, chapter 2, the English working class as the mirror of production. So he begins here by clarifying that he's not interested in imposing categories or expectations on the English working class, like alienation, exploitation, or impoverishment. Just saying, for example, that the English working classes in the 16th and 17th centuries, that they were alienated, exploited, and impoverished. Indeed, they were, but he wants to put a pin in that for a moment. He wants to analyze these people as they were and how they viewed themselves. He will also question the oft-held assumption that socialism emerged following industrialization and the French Revolution, which is a very common idea. And we'll see this play out in other ways as well, but like the celebration of the French Revolution, which is just really a celebration of like Europe in a lot of cases. And really one of the biggest culprits for all of this, I think of Zizek. I know Zizek isn't like, we shouldn't be taking Zizek as an exemplary Marxist, but he's like super guilty of all this. He's like, yeah, the stuff that he's written about Muslims, the ways he himself, centuries after the fact, has justified Marx's views on colonizing India. Like, this guy is totally guilty of all this stuff, while also being a not very good Marxist. It's kind of weird, but whatever. And this, I think, reveals one of the other tensions that Robinson is talking about here, and that is the way in which that Marxists tend to, like, only offer the dream of communism and everything it stands for as something to happen in the future, and something that can only happen once we've gone through the filter of capitalism, i.e. gone through the filter of like European rationalism. But that aside, it's like, but we've had this, like, people, this is people's kind of automatic way of being is communist. And it seems strange for Marxists to be like, oh, and the way we'll get there is through all these processes, and eventually we'll get there, where there are people on Earth that are like, we're living this right now. You know that we can do it? Like, we're living it right now. And it seems, it's very interesting the way that in some cases, Marxists tend to monopolize and tend to like totally erase these histories, these other ways of imagining how communism can happen right here, right now, by offering it as this like eventuality that we have to go through certain, the right proper phases and knowledges, etc., to get there. And one of the ways I like to think about this is like, okay, revolution happens, great, I'm with you, let's do it. What will education look like after the revolution? Like, are we going to be teaching, like, you know, indigenous knowledge systems? Are we going to be teaching children, like, is it going to be very important that in classrooms or however we do teaching that they're going to be learning about, like, the intimate dance of root systems in their furnishing us with all the plentiful food that we can access from the earth? Like, is that what we're going to learn? Or are we going to learn about how to send more rocket ships into space that are going to land on planets for no good reason other than just to satisfy a neo kind of colonial oppressive desire? You know, and these things, these questions, they're stubbornly unanswered. Or if they are answered, they just come out and say, like, yeah, we're going to be teaching, like, schooling will follow the proper rationalist scheme of European knowledge systems. And it's in these moments that it's like, okay, what are we really after here? Seems like more like this is an effort to kind of turn the world into Europe instead of the world into communists. And it's just incredibly reductive to reduce the emergence of like class consciousness to the French Revolution and the industrial working classes, because this implies as though like productive knowledge, discipline of the workforce, transportation infrastructure, trade agreements, scientific advances and knowledges, all of this just appeared like almost overnight, and in Europe of all places, in England and France of all places, as though no one else on earth could have been open up to this possibility. You know, this kind of Eurocentrism and European celebration or whatever really holds the movement back, I think. And that's exactly what Robinson thinks too. So during industrialization, the workers did not form a coherent class either, just like the bourgeois didn't in the examples I gave before. They were splintered between workers, part-time workers, quote-unquote criminals like the lumpen proletariat, unpaid workers, enslaved people, feudal workers. You had apprentices, you had artisans, you had traders that, you know, the sidekicks, whatever. You had so many different kinds of workers that were all engaged in their own kinds of resistances, like peasant revolts, which doesn't comply with a neat Marxist view of the world at all, because peasants are technically, they don't possess the right kind of class consciousness that they should to move the needle forward, as Marx had predicted. And again, with all this, I want to make it really clear that I will defend Marx till the day I die. Like, that's not gonna, I don't want you to come away thinking like, with any of this means to discredit the Marxist project. I don't think so at all. I think it just, as I think Robinson would agree, there are things it needs to consider. So he writes, the class consciousness of English workers did not strictly adhere to the logic of working class formation premised on capitalist exploitation. Rather, he continues, extreme forms of racism among the English working class determined the form and characteristic that English working class consciousness assumed. So what was uniting many of these people was not so much their entry into a certain kind of class as working class, but instead he's like, what was uniting these people was European racism, European logics of domination and colonialism, where they were like, sure, they were working classes, but they were also vying for European colonial efforts and expansions into various parts of the world because of these promises of riches that would come to them through that. They weren't like, oh, we're workers now, therefore we recognize we're being exploited and we have to undo all this. Robinson's like, no, when you're dealing with racism, what we find is that workers don't just unite on the basis of being workers. That workers will actually still be like racist. They will direct that racism towards other workers who are just not the right skin color as they are. And it will be another tool of distinguishing that us versus them logic that often goes so unexamined. And all of this is certainly true of the English treatment of the Irish. The English dispossessed the Irish and exploited their labor power because as a believed to be inferior people, their most useful function was as laborers. So centuries of English colonialism and capitalist exploitation would color Irish nationalism as it developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. But we must be careful here, obviously. Like, that would have an effect on Irish nationalism for sure. But we have to be careful not to fall into the racist nationalist trap here. Terms like English and Irish are already fictions. Like, well, what does that even mean? Like, of course, and this is one of the tricks of colonialism, is that colonialism creates the conditions where you have to adopt its logics to oppose it. Like, when people across the world were being colonized mostly by Europe, it's not as though the Europeans were going into countries. They were going into regions that had like people who spoke a certain dialect, and then if you went to another region, the people probably spoke a totally different language. They might have had different gods if they had gods, different spiritualities, different, so many different things. And then when these people are all then mutually oppressed in the same way, who are then thrown into these horrible conditions, they can't even likely probably speak to one another. It is then that they're forced to kind of take on a common tongue, a common national identity to oppose their oppressors. But the harm in that is that that identity was not true in the first place. Like, there was no such thing as like an Irish, like to be Irish. Like, what is that? Like, was everyone there like, oh yeah, I'm Irish, as the colonizers were? Like, no, this is an imposed category on them. But this is one of the overall harms of colonialism, in that it expects people to adopt these same logics in order to oppose it. That's why it's quite clever, actually. But this is just another thing. Like, even the way I'm talking about like English and Irish, etc. in this case, like, this is a sign of another tool, a kind of organizational tool that is problematic and oppressive that predates capitalism. Like, and that we often just don't interrogate that much. You read like Benedict Anderson or something, and you might get some, questioning the very identity or idea of nations, but it often just goes totally unexamined. You offer things like Russian people or Chinese people or whatever, Ugandan people. It's like, what does that really mean? What does that really mean? Who are we talking about here? And especially at the time, like, it's not like these people could bring up on a phone or computer and look at what their now the region that they inhabit looks like, that they can freely move through. Like, they're just seeing their immediate day-to-day world, the trees that they're used to seeing in wherever their region is, that river there, like, that's their world, and to then be associated with this broader nationalist identity is really messed up. It's really messed up, and it's like it's a violent tool of oppression. And so, speaking of the harms of nationalism, let's get into chapter 3, titled Socialist Theory and Nationalism. And we're going to get into this more in the next episode, but like, socialism, Marxist commentary on capitalism, has had a little bit of a tricky relationship with nationalism. You get different schools of thought on this, like Lenin versus Stalin versus Trotsky, others, Rosa Luxemburg, etc. People who've really wrestled with the role of the nation. Now, there's lots of good arguments from both sides. Like, I'm not the last word on this. A lot of people a lot smarter than me know a lot more about this than I do. But there are good arguments for the nationalist thing, because capitalism works through nations. And it's difficult to imagine a kind of resistance to something, to a nation that isn't itself a nation, given the kind of military tools that nations possess, given the kind of power they possess. It seems like the only way to combat it is through nations. So I see the value there. I mean, I think the end goal should be to abolish nations altogether, but I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that, at least we're not yet. So people need to adopt nations, but it's been a tricky thing in Marxist circles. So scientific socialists often attribute their unmatched dialectical consciousness to the 19th century. However, it comes from there. However, the communism they espouse has much earlier roots in the civilizations of Egypt, ancient Greece, and Asia Minor. Like I mentioned before, socialism is not something to happen in the future. We've had it in the past. Even though there's this really clarifying letter that Engels wrote once. I can't remember where it is. If any of you have the, I think you can find it in that red copy of like the Marx Engels Reader, where Engels clarifies to someone he's writing to. He's like, the project that we're aiming for is not about going backwards. It's about going forwards in time. But that says a lot. That says a lot, because what that is saying is that, those people, what they're doing, that's not communism. They're just stuck in the past. They're an undeveloped stage of human history. Of course, they like to think that what they're doing is good, but really what we need to do is go through all the exploitations of capitalism to get all the cool stuff we want, and then let's be equal about it. That's more of what's going on here. Now, even during Marx and Engels' time, it's really important to clarify that they weren't the only socialists or, communists per se. Other people were thinking about this stuff too, and they had a lot of problems with each other. Like there's Proudhon, there was a few other ones that were all doing their own socialist things that were different from Marx and Engels. I mean, I'm obviously on Marx and Engels' side here, but Robinson just raises this to be like, look, even these ideas of socialism, these ideas that are even related to Marxism, they aren't everyone doesn't just agree with them, and they didn't just agree with them all the time. These things have always been debated and negotiated, and that's one of the beauties of it. Anyone who thinks that it's settled or we have it figured out I wish I possessed that kind of certainty. I really wish I did, but I don't. But it troubles the idea that scientific socialism is just this homogeneous, all agreed upon universal thing. Scientific socialists like to erase or ignore this fact to, in his words, obscure the obvious, that the origins of socialist thought are not with the European proletariat, but are actually with the middle classes. And I was like, this is a good point. It's a good point. There's a guy named David McClellan. He writes that socialist ideas were spread by a party of the intellectual elite who saw the proletarian masses as a possible instrument of social renewal. That is, from the old feudal order into the enlightened bourgeois order. So you even had socialists that were just treating the exploited masses not as victims, but as a site of possibility to something new, to this new possibility of socialism, and of taking European history outside of its feudal period into something new that would just be more exploitative on a much grander scale. But the middle class comment is really interesting in that, and this is just my experience, where organizing people and workers don't do so with a refined, comprehensive understanding of Marxist doctrine. I think that, in my experience, they do so recognizing the immediate plight that they're experiencing, and they aren't trying to mount an anti-capitalist resistance to the world they're living in. I wish they would. Obviously, that would be great. But people aren't, when they're actually working lives, they don't have time to pine through Marx and to understand the intricacies of anti-capitalist resistance. That's not what people fight for. And it's incredibly ironic that then their efforts are either diminished as being reactionary or just being trade unionist, just reformist, whatever, or some other Marxists will be well, actually what they're doing is Marxist because it's just of a certain period of class consciousness or whatever. Whatever the answer is, it's okay, why does it need to be either? Why can't this be another thing, another example of a kind of resistive moment or potential that doesn't need to be attributed to this European doctrine of world history? And Marxism has historically, very embarrassingly, been very much a kind of middle-class pursuit and interest that has bestowed this narrative, rightly or wrongly, onto working-class people as a way by which to undo their oppression, at least in the best-case scenario. There are other cases where it seemed just wanted to turbocharge their oppression, or Marx was it's totally cool if we just colonize all these parts of the world that are underdeveloped, that kind of thing. Now, again, Marx is great. Marx is really great, and this stuff is really important. But it's, I think it's important not to just attribute everything to Marxism or everything being against Marxism. Because like I said before, many of the resistance movements that emerged, even those anti-capitalist Marxist-inspired ones, they weren't coming from the enlightened or conscious working classes. They were coming from peasants. Like the Russian Revolution, like, come on. China, most of those people had gone to like school. And if you read Marx, he's very clear that in order for capitalism to be undone, we have to see the benefits of capitalism in the way that capitalism allows like a lot of money to be made, a lot of new technology to be made, people have more access to knowledge, etc. All these things, these kind of conditions need to be met. But they haven't always been met, and there have been very effective anti-capitalist movements. I mean, we can go on and on about how effective they actually were, but like the most effective we've ever seen, and maybe that's a kind of bias, like a researcher bias, whatever that one is called. But I think it's still significant. Even in the famous Conspiracy of Equals from the late 18th century, Babeuf writes that we see the resisting class was not proletarian, it was poor farmers, shopkeepers, artisans, peasants, etc. The class consciousness of the English workers did not strictly adhere to the logic of working class formulation premised on capitalist exploitation, as he said before, or as Robinson said before. It took on different forms, responding to different kinds of oppressions. And Robinson suggests that this omission, this forgetting about these other people with other needs, not necessarily just like capitalist resistance, etc., in socialist history prevents Marxists from seeing beyond a very narrow battlefield of the struggle. And he goes so far as to say this in the service of capital. He says that while the movements of the working classes tended towards an accommodation with capitalism in the form of trade unions, unionist demands, abandoning revolutionary initiatives to those whose social origins were, most often, the peasant and petit bourgeois classes, socialist theory became more and more dominated by the figure of the revolutionary proletariat, even as that was less and less true. So working classes in Europe were relatively much better off than those other people, like peasants, obviously enslaved people, etc. So many other people that are extremely exploited. And again, I'm not trying to pit them against one another, say that one is like better than the other. Obviously we're dealing with exploitations that all deserve to be taken very seriously. But with this, Robinson just identifies that many of those people weren't actually resisting at all, and the resistance was coming from these other groups because those people were benefiting off of the other kind of oppressive mechanisms at play, like racism that was justifying enslaving people to provide cheap products for these laborers that was trickling into the European economy. So they were benefiting not only off of capitalist exploitation of those parts of the world, but also the racism, sexism, like that today, for example. Like, it's always funny to me to watch Marxist short circuit when you mention something like, oh yeah, like how women's labor is so often exploited in like the home, for example. But then they're like, no, you're reactionary. Nope, this is just like, reformist type nonsense, shouldn't be taken seriously. That's just going to distract from the movement. Not all Marxists. Obviously, there's a long history of socialist feminism. I don't want to erase that at all. Just there tends to be some within white dude Marxist circles that really get sensitive if you mention something like that. So be warned. It's also fun if you want to watch a white dude short circuit in front of you. Mention some stuff like that. Maybe you can film it. Don't film someone if you don't have their consent. But it's a thing. You can watch it in real time. Ooh, especially if you found a grad school one. Oh, the grad school Marxists. Those are the fun ones. A lot of them. They're a good time. You could try that with them. That'd be fun. And to conclude this chapter here in this part, like, Robinson ends by looking again at this question of nationalism to say that we can't lose sight of the fact that for Marx and Engels, they really lionized the nation and celebrated the idea of the state. And I'm just using these terms interchangeably for the sake of brevity. But they identified these structures as a catalyst or catalysts for both capitalism and class consciousness. So, for example, they really celebrated like German nationalism, like, German philosophical history, social history, workers' history, etc. They really celebrated this, but then they were also very much opposed to like calls for Indian nationalism or Mexican nationalism. In those cases, Marx and Engels weren't so cool with that. They didn't like that so much. They're like, no. Whereas then you get people like Rosa Luxemburg, who thought the idea of the nation was pure ideology. Like she was not going to have any of that. I mean, Luxemburg is a genius. I've covered some of her stuff if you want to go check that out. But Lenin, on the other hand, also thought it could be politically strategic, though, to use the state. And Stalin believed in national self-determination. You see across the spectrum of Marxists, from Stalin to Lenin to Luxemburg to Marx and Engels, like very different views about the state, about the nation. But this reveals, again, this isn't a settled science, and there's a lot of room here for the investment of certain historically oppressive categories and mechanisms to find their way into these doctrines, and how these doctrines, like Marxism, doesn't just exist above even the material conditions it's found in. Like, it's going to adopt them as well, even the oppressive ones, even as it tries not to. And it is by engaging with Marxism and looking at some of the things it takes for granted, like it's being okay with enslavement sometimes, like right from Marx, enslavement, colonialism, nationalism, racialism, racism, like these are all things that Marxism has historically not taken super seriously, except when it has, because of course it has. I don't want to be too reductive here. But they also show how it still needs a lot of examination. But yeah, we'll end that there. We'll pick up with episode 2 next time. Sorry for the absence for a while. I should be back into the swing of things normally. But yeah, if you like what I did, you can like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. I'm sure they'd get a kick out of it. And if not, y'all can just yell at me online. Just tell me how I don't know anything. I'd love to hear it. But yeah, on that note, hope you're all doing well. Take care.